Hi there, it's great to be joined by Kate Middleton today. Thank you so much, Kate, for spending some time with us, helping us explore how we can, help our congregations in this time of COVID. During this period of COVID, lockdown and uncertainty, how's it actually impacting congregations, do you think?
Yeah, and I guess if we're honest as leaders, it's impacting our congregations the same way that it's impacting us. And one of the interesting things about this season has been that sort of universality in some ways, that this weird situation that has changed so much is something that has impacted pretty much everyone. But of course, people's personal circumstances vary. So some people have had situations and challenges that are tougher. Some people have found certain situations and challenges tougher than others. But I think the one thing that everybody shares, because we are all human, is that it's just raised our baseline stress level. And we tend to think of stress as the same thing as distress. So if we're not distressed, we think, well, why should I be stressed? But actually, stress is anything that requires demand of your body, your brain, anything that needs you to adapt, to react. So in this situation that has been so much about change, so much about things like loss of your normal rhythm and routine, because your brain uses that to keep demand low because it sort of goes on automatic pilot. We've had to think of whole new ways of doing everything, even shopping, or whether your kids are in school or not. And it feels like the minute you've got used to something, it changes. So your rhythm and routine's gone, and then the uncertainty, the changeability, just having to figure out what the latest set of rules and restrictions mean, all of that. Everybody's stress level has risen. And I guess what's interesting about that is that we do all have this crisis point where we have a genuine limit to our capacity to how much we can juggle, how much we can handle. And when you get to the edge of that overwhelmed space where you start to feel like you might go under, you just feel like, I can't do this anymore, I can't cope. We become very prickly. Emotions like anxiety and frustration are on the same physiological scale. So we're much more prone to feeling anxious, to being frustrated, to lashing out. And it changes the way our brains work too. When you're in that overwhelmed space, your brain goes onto a kind of emergency setting. It's trying to simplify the world and simplify your decision making, because it is this literal space of like, I'm exhausted, I'm overwhelmed, and that means that you're more likely to make snap decisions, you're more likely to make mistakes, you're less good at problem solving. So not only are you more emotional, but you can't think of any ways to solve the situation you're facing. It's tricky, and in all of that, the loss of control, because all of this stuff that's happening, not just to us, to our loved ones, to our kids, to our churches, it's not in our control. We can't actually change it, and we can't make it end. It's not like we can come up with a clever plan and solve this. We've just got to figure out a way to keep treading water until this season's over. But that loss of control is such an intrinsic challenge to us as humans. And therefore, what we've seen over what's now, 8 months or so, is just a rising challenge with dealing with this sense of despair. Because you have a center in your brain that triggers despair, and it's very much triggered by that feeling of being out of control. It's such a human intrinsic desire to be in control and sort of have influence over your surroundings and your situation.
Wow, so much that actually resonates with me as well. So thank you for that. Really helpful as a kind of big, backdrop. Now, we're not trained in church leadership to be able to kind of pastor during a pandemic. What should our role be as church leaders when it comes to being there pastorally for our congregations? Are there certain boundaries we ought to put up as leaders?
Yeah, I think that has been, again, a really interesting challenge and interesting question. And some of this comes from your sort of foundational philosophy of what pastoral care should be. And many churches, the sort of history of pastoral care has been very much a crisis-driven thing. So someone breaks a leg, you get a bunch of people to cook dinners for them for 4 months or whatever it is that they need. I think what's interesting about this season has been the challenge to emotional mental health. And one of the things that my colleagues at Mind and Soul Foundation and I have done really for nearly 2 decades now is just encouraging the church to be more aware of mental and emotional needs as well as physical needs, and how that plays into pastoral care. But this season has been unusual in how it's pushed all of us into a space where those things are relevant. And ideally, mental and emotional well-being is something that we don't want to be crisis and illness driven on. So we don't want to wait till someone has a breakdown before we support them. And in this season, therefore, what our challenge is to think, how can we help people? How can we support people? How can we help them to sustain themselves and their families to live as well as you possibly can through a really tough season? And so I think our potential, the possibility of what we can do as pastors is actually really exciting. It's things like demystifying, helping people understand why they're feeling what they are, like the conversation we've literally just had. Because if in areas where your emotional and mental health is under pressure, if you don't understand, the risk is that you've got your initial emotional response that you're already struggling with, but you add to it one of two things. You add guilt, which is like, maybe if I was a better Christian, if I had more faith in God, maybe if I was just a better person or more mature or something, I wouldn't feel like this. And you start to beat yourself up, and that makes it worse. Or fear. So like, what is happening to me? So many people in this season have said, like, I just don't feel like myself. What's wrong with me? I never used to react like this. I never used to be this grumpy, or I never used to find it so hard to enjoy anything. What's wrong? Have I changed? And so if we can take guilt and fear out of the emotional equation, we can really help them manage. And I guess the other thing is about universally, what culture do we set in our communities, and can we spread that beyond our church community? So genuinely talking about a space where it is okay not to be okay, but this isn't just about when you have a crisis. This is about life is tough sometimes. So how do we do that together? How do we talk about these challenges, not in terms of like, here's an illness you've got, but like, how do you manage stress so you stay well? How do you deal with anxiety if you've never experienced that before? And some of those things. Wow. And of course, more than anything, what we can do is we can hold hope, and we can talk a better story. You know, in this season when despair can be such an overwhelming story, and it spreads because it makes us anxious. So anxiety triggers your attention, it grabs your attention, and it focuses your mind, and it keeps things in the front of your mind. So as humans, we're much more likely to share negative stories than positive. But as people of God, we've got a unique understanding, a unique perspective, and a really good motivation to be saying, actually, let's remember some good stuff here. Let's remember, not that we have to deny all the difficult stuff is happening and put on some kind of fake happy face, but we can say, yes, this is really tough and difficult and challenging, but this is also true. And there is a God story here, and there is hope. And this is not the end of people's story.
I guess as a church leader, then, if I've got maybe a church of 100 people, they're often all looking to me to try and support them in this. But I guess, is there a way to try and help our congregants to actually support each other in this kind of time as well?
We are in this situation. So for me, I'm a psychologist and a church leader, I don't think I've ever encountered a situation where the stuff I'm sharing with people is so much also stuff I'm having to put into place to keep myself head above water, you know. And so we have to be realistic to our own needs too, and recognizing that if we do that, it helps us support them. So we model something really valuable in the way that we do that, the way we talk about it. Not being crisis driven. So I think as church leaders, we've got better at talking about when we've hit crisis, although we tend to like to talk about it when we've come out of it. So it's like, oh yeah, I had this episode and I didn't tell you at the time, but now I'm feeling better, let me talk about it. But I'm just talking about the day-to-day reality, you know, the less polished little moments of our own life. What's the thing that you're finding difficult this week? Here's what I'm struggling with. Here's some moments that have been difficult. And I think then we can get the balance between then encouraging one another, but also creating a space where it's okay to share. I mean, your question about how do you do pastoral care in a large congregation is that your foundation does need to be about creating a culture where people organically care for one another. And in the season, even before COVID, one of our biggest challenges in pastoral care was about teaching and growing the basic skills of friendship. You know, so many people struggle with how to make and develop and sustain really good, connective, supportive friendships. And I think in this season, because we're then disconnected from our friendships and it's become even harder, that's all the more the case. So good structures of groups, spaces where people can meet, and then encouraging people to have radar, to be looking out for one another, reaching out to people. And I think in this season, it's been called friendship funneling, what's happened, because it's been harder to stay in touch. Everybody's reduced their connections down to the sort of 2 or 3 most crucial, most sort of strong central friendships. But most of our friendship colour and connection comes from the peripheral people. And the risk is that some of those people who maybe because of life circumstances or just being really busy or young children or whatever, they don't have the time to build into a lot of those friendships. So as friendship funding's happened, they found that they've dropped off the edge of everybody's friendship radar. And so there will be some people in your church, in everyone's church, who have found themselves alone, which is gutting in this season, to think maybe I wasn't one of the 2 or 3 most important people to anyone. That's devastating. So encouraging people to say, when someone comes to mind and you just think, oh gosh, I've not seen, Joe or Fred or whoever for 6 months, don't just think of it and let that thought go. See that as a God nudge, send them a text, ask them how they're doing, get in touch, try and arrange a one-to-one walk if it's this month or next month, if you're allowed to get together again, get together, let's think about how we can organically care for one another, because that is realistically the way that most pastoral care has to work. Church pastoral teams, we can get involved at the more organized level, but most of it's going to be about helping people learn how to do real friendship.
So in this kind of moment we're in right now, what should be some of the kind of needs we should be specifically looking out for, I guess, in our congregations across the UK? Perhaps
unusually prominently in this season, what we are looking for is the people who have disappeared. And pastoral care is, I've led pastoral care for a couple of decades now in church. And so I know too, it's so easy for us to get drawn into doing all of our energy gets spent on the people who allowed us. Mm. But actually, always in pastoral care, we need to have a mind and a radar for the people who have gone quiet, but particularly in this season, because when you are exhausted and overwhelmed, when you've used your energy, let's say you're a frontline worker and this has just been a brutal season and it's still carrying on, or maybe one of the groups of people who we know from research are struggling the most, they struggled the most in the last lockdown, they're struggling the most now, are parents who are juggling work and small children or homeschooling, stuff like that. Or maybe there are people who in your congregations who've lost jobs or who are anxious about running businesses, people like that. All of these people are in that space of overwhelm and exhaustion. And when you're in that place, it's incredibly difficult to reach out because you're exhausted, that you just don't have time to phone someone, send a text, try and explain why you're feeling so awful. So what happens is people disappear. And so I think that's almost what you've got to do, both and so it's proactively thinking, asking and praying. And we are so reliant on the grace of God in this season. So much of my pastoral time is spent creating a space, literally praying, saying, God, who do I need to message this week? Nudge me, because with my human ability, I'm going to forget people and lose people, but God is amazing at just bringing people to mind at the right time. And then we can be proactive also in our pastoral care about reaching out. And so one thing that I'm encouraging people to do is think about groups who might be more vulnerable, might be struggling more, people with kids under 1, people who they used to be commuters, but they can't commute now because they've been working from home for 8 months, people who run their own businesses, people who are elderly or would have been on the original shielding list. All of these are different groups, and what you can do is proactively reach out to a group and perhaps try and do a different group every week or every couple of weeks. And then it's a bit like fishing. If you keep casting your net in different places, hopefully you will pick up people who are struggling. But I think we have to be much more intentional. So many people are saying, oh gosh, my pastoral care is really quiet right now. It's like, I thought it would be really difficult, but that's because you won't hear unless you reach out. Or you might hear a small subset, particularly people who have pre-existing problems, who know about the pastoral support system in your church. It's amazing. So many people in our congregations are sort of blissfully unaware that we even have a pastoral care system because they've never really needed it. But this season has pushed them into a space where they're struggling. So I think it is probably about proactively reaching out.
I guess the final thing is, are there any practical tools that we should be putting in the hands of congregations right now to really help them to navigate this time?
Yeah, and I think it is practical tools that are about helping us to build into place good patterns, good rhythms, good routines, things we can do that will help us get through. As I say, this is a really unusual season because we cannot solve it. We have to sustain it. And that's a different challenge to perhaps what we're used to doing in pastoral care, where we might be thinking, how can we intervene to make this situation different? Now, we can't take away the challenge right now, but we can help people to manage it as well as possible. So we are talking things like, how do you recognize and manage heightened stress? How do you understand and deal with an emotion like anxiety better in a season where we are all more anxious than usual? So often people talk of anxiety as an illness, but it's also a normal human emotion, and we will all be experiencing higher levels of anxiety than normal. So how do you deal with that? Teaching what emotions are, looking at what the Bible really says about some of this stuff, and practical skills like, as I say, how do you form friendships? What does the Bible say about friendships? Or why is it so important to connect with nature, to get into the outdoors, stuff like that? Teaching people good emotional sustaining skills, and I would say also spiritual skills, because when we're in that overwhelmed space, it's harder to connect with God than normal. And in a season where also our normal routines to do that, our church services, our normal spaces, our groups, our prayer meetings are in a lot of cases gone completely, or they look and feel really different, we're all having to explore different ways of connecting with God. So things like Pete Gregg's the prayer courses, things like that are really good because they are a practical, almost a sort of almost a scientific approach to being quite analytical, trying new things out and seeing what works. Because you may find in this season that your usual routines and approaches to connect with God it's just too hard because your brain is too inundated with other stuff.